Howdy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the ConocoPhillips White House Lecture Series. I'd like to first of all acknowledge the support of ConocoPhillips in making this program possible. It brings to life the various offices of the White House and offices associated with the White House. Throughout the years, we've had lectures on the National Security Council, on the Chief of Staff's office, and today we're very happy to have Laurie Firestone deliver a lecture on the White House Social Secretary's office. But first of all, an acknowledgement is due. As I mentioned, ConocoPhillips has been very generous with its support, and we have representatives from the ConocoPhillips office in Houston, headed by Sylvia Hansen and her husband David, and Erica and Simon, also here from Rodriguez from ConocoPhillips. So thank you for joining us. I had the pleasure of working with Laurie during her times as White House Social Secretary during the presidency of George Bush, approximately from 1988 through 1993, if you count the transition year of 88, the months of the transition. Previous to that, Laurie served as the Social Secretary in the Vice President's office, Vice President Bush's office. Currently, she works with the University of Southern California and is Director of the Office of Development for Regional Programs. She's also been an advisor and has appeared or consulted with ABC, CNN, C-SPAN, and was one of the consultants on the movie The American President, if you recall that movie. She's also on the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities. Having her here tonight brings back many fond memories. I tell you, Laurie can really set a table and make a meal look and taste delicious. So I think you're going to get a flavor of that here today. Laurie will speak for approximately 20 to 25 minutes, and she has a number of slides and anecdotes that will entertain you, I'm sure. After her presentation, she'll be more than happy to take questions from the audience. We'll have about 15 minutes of questions. At the conclusion of our program, Laurie will be available to do a book signing of our latest book, An Affair to Remember. It's An Affair to Remember. I'm getting old. An Affair to Remember, which will be available in the lobby. She'll do the book signing, as I mentioned. There'll also be a small reception, so we welcome all of you to please join us for the reception and the book signing. I would also like to remind everyone that after the book signing, the library is open. We have a new exhibit that just opened this week, the White House in miniature. So this is a great opportunity to see how state dinners, luncheons, and other functions were set up at the White House, and then move over to the White House itself across the plaza and see how it's lit up and how the furnishings are and all the entertaining that took place in the White House actually looks in the realm of the White House. So it's an exciting evening. I'm glad you could join us here tonight. And it gives me great pleasure now, ladies and gentlemen, to call upon Laurie Firestone.
Well, thank you, Roman, very much for that very kind invitation. And I've just learned that to start the evening off, I should say howdy. Okay. Well, it's a thrill for me, obviously, to be here at the library and to talk to you a little bit about this wonderful job that I had as White House Social Secretary for the Bushes. But before I start, I just want to tell you it's a little strange to be here and to be speaking, because I feel as if I should be in the audience watching either the former president or the First Lady. I would feel a lot more comfortable. So anyway, in my book that Roman just referred to, An Affair to Remember, my goal for the book was to share some of my remarkable experiences as an eyewitness to history, and to provide an accessible home entertaining book that captures the spirit of a state dinner so that you can make your events at home more memorable. Along with the pictures and some anecdotes, there are images of the menu cards, and these are placed on everybody's plate when you come to a formal dinner or luncheon at the White House. And so you can see exactly what the menu is and what dishes we served. I worked with food editors and chefs to take some of those wonderful dishes that we had and do simplified menus, simplified recipes, so that you could do them at home without any trouble. In the book, I've also included a few of the original recipes by Hans Roffert, and he was the White House chef when I was there. He actually served through 5 presidents, 12 years as the executive sous chef and 11 years as the executive chef. The book is focused, as I said, on state dinners because nothing is really more exciting than being invited to the White House for a formal dinner. And I remember my very first dinner when Richard Nixon was president. My husband and I were invited to a dinner in honor of Ray Bliss, the retiring chairman of the Republican National Committee. I was a very young mother of 4 children, and it was very thrilling to be invited to this dinner. And I remember the dinner as walking into the White House with beautiful flowers and the Marine Orchestra playing throughout the evening. We had a delicious dinner, 4-course dinner, and 3 wonderful wines to go along with it. And that evening, to my delight and surprise, I was seated at the president's table. And I even had the nerve, you can tell I was very young, because I had the nerve to get up and ask him for his autograph during dessert, which he graciously signed, but may I say, we would never have allowed that. In any event, it was a magical evening and one of my treasured memories. I never dreamed that years later I would become the White House social secretary and that it would be my job to help create that same atmosphere and magical feeling so that everyone who came to attend a White House event would feel that wonderful experience of a lifetime. Tonight, I wanted to share with you some of the pictures. A few of them are in the book and some of them aren't, and just some of my experiences during this very, very exciting time in my life. I worked for the Bushes for 12 years, 1981 to 1993. First as social secretary to Barbara Bush at the Vice President's, and then as White House social secretary when Mr. Bush became our 41st president and Barbara First Lady. As I mentioned, they say that working for president is like being an eyewitness to history. But what they don't tell you is that history zooms by at a dizzying pace, and you are a part of it. It was a tremendous time in our nation's history with so much going on in the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the victory of the Persian Gulf, just to name a few. How fortunate I was to have this opportunity to work for the leader of the free world and First Lady. Before I tell you about working at the White House, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background. I first met the Bushes when very close friends of mine, Pat and Dean Burge, he was chairman of the FCC, brought them to the Bushes to my home to play tennis one Sunday afternoon. As you know, President Bush loved to play tennis, and so did Barbara, actually. The Bushes had just returned from China to become director of the CIA, and the prior 2 years he had been the U.S. liaison representative to the People's Republic of China. Believe me, that day I had no idea that in a few years Bush would soon be the Vice President of the United States and then the President of the United States, and I would be working for him. In looking back over the years at the vice presidents, I now realize that it was my training ground for the White House position. However, it was my experiences in volunteer work, which I'm sure many of you can identify with, and doing business entertaining, and being a homemaker raising 5 children that were my credentials for the vice president's job. My office was a bit different because I was actually up at the vice president's residence at the Naval Observatory. All of the entertaining that the vice president and Mrs. Bush did was informal compared to the White House entertaining. Mrs. Bush would entertain several times a month, having guests for coffees, lunches, and teas. And together, they often hosted cocktail receptions and dinners. Many times, there were foreign dignitaries who would come to the residence for an off-the-record visit. Off the record meaning no press. My job was varied and exciting, no 2 days ever the same. In addition to planning the parties, I arranged all the flowers for the house. I worked with Barbara and Mark Hampton, a New York interior designer, in the redecorating of the vice president's residence. I had always loved interior decorating, so you can imagine how fun it was for me to work with a world-renowned decorator. Couple times a year, Barbara and I would go to New York City for her to buy clothes on 7th Avenue, and of course that was always fun. We went to several designers, the most well-known being Arnold Scaasi and Bill Blass. Both men were wonderful, and I adored them. Sometimes when we were in New York, we'd visit Judith Lieber, the designer of the beautiful handbags, and Mildred Montejeda, the well-known China designer. It was always interesting and fun. And throughout those 8 years, I got to know all the Bush family and their friends. And in turn, the Bushes got to know my family. My children were included in Christmas parties, summer barbecues, and even occasional horseshoe games. In many ways, the Bushes treated me like an extended family, and I think they did that with so many of the staff and makes them so unique and wonderful. And that made it possible for me to balance both work and family. In 1998, when Vice President Bush was elected president, I was asked to be the White House Social Secretary. And this position, although it had the same title, was really quite different from the position at the vice president's. And one dramatic difference for me was that everything we did was covered by the press. And the Bushes, and really all of us to some extent, it was like living in a fishbowl and working in a fishbowl. And this was a huge challenge because you had to face this every day for every event. You did not want to make any mistakes. There were no second chances. Having said that, my job was the most unique and probably the most exciting job of all the jobs at the White House. Everyone loves to come to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and they love it because of the history and the grandeur of the building, and then when you ask them to a party, it's even that much more wonderful. Our goal was always to create a warm and gracious atmosphere so that the President and First Lady could make their guests feel welcome and relaxed in the People's House. When our guests had a good time, it made me feel as if I had accomplished my goal. Officially, I was on the First Lady's staff and a political appointee. Although my title was White House Social Secretary, I did not do secretarial work. Exactly. I was responsible for planning and executing all the events that took place in the White House, and also for the events that the President and First Lady hosted outside the White House. Consequently, I went on almost every trip with them, whether it be foreign or domestic. Mrs. Bush had a wonderful staff led by Susan Porter Rose, her chief of staff, who I think is here tonight. I don't know if she got in. Is she here? Susan, maybe she isn't. Anyway, she led the staff and did a fabulous job. We had hundreds of events over the 4 years, entertaining an average of 40,000 people a year. The only way I was able to accomplish this was to have a really reliable staff working with me. It was truly a team effort. I had a wonderful deputy assistant, Kathy Fenton, who later went on to become Laura Bush's social secretary for 4 years. I had an executive assistant, Celeste Dorsey, and 2 other assistants tracked all the guest lists for all the events. I work closely with the White House civil servants. Those are the people who remain at the White House no matter who is president. People like the chefs or the florists, calligraphers, resident staff. And I also worked with all the president's staff, from scheduling to national security to Secret Service. Creating an ambiance, an atmosphere, or setting the mood was always an important element of the job. Presidents come and go, and with them their particular style of entertaining. Through the years, the Bushes had combined their East Coast backgrounds and their love of Texas informality into a very relaxed but elegant style. And it was my job to extend this style of entertaining into everything they did. Mrs. Bush and I worked closely planning all major events, but the smaller ones she left up to me. Fortunately, because of our years together at the Vice President's, I think she had confidence in me. We both loved flowers and felt that they, plus the music, really set the tone of the party. But of course, there are many aspects to planning a successful event. The invitation list, the menu, the seating arrangements, the entertainment, and even the china. I know that some people feel and say that the devil is in the details, but for me, the angel was in those same details. And now I'd like to show you some of my slides. This is the picture of the north side of the White House. There are 45 functional rooms in the White House, and we used every one of them for entertaining, from the ground floor to the state floor to the private family quarters, which are on the second and third floors. This is in the West End sitting room in the family quarters on the second floor. I'm being introduced to Prince Philip. Also pictured here is Will Farish, who was later ambassador to Great Britain under our current president, George W. Bush. Here I'm meeting Queen Elizabeth in her famous hat. Maybe you all remember the incident of the talking hat. When the Queen was making her remarks at the arrival ceremony on the South Lawn during her state visit, the aide neglected to pull out the step behind the podium to bring her to the correct height behind the microphone. She, of course, being a true queen, never said anything at the time and carried on as if nothing were wrong. However, the following day, she addressed a joint session of Congress, and she said, she opened her remarks with, I hope everyone can see me. Many occasions at the White House were large receptions, such as the Kennedy Center honors held in the East Room. This is a multi-purpose room used for events ranging from state dinners to press conferences. Here, the President and Mrs. Bush paid tribute to the honorees before going to the Kennedy Center performance. I love this picture of Mrs. Bush with Katharine Hepburn in the grand foyer the night she was honored at the Kennedy Center. Whenever there was a free evening, President and Mrs. Bush loved to have friends and government officials over for dinner and a movie. They understood the vital importance of developing close relationships, and entertaining is an ideal vehicle for helping people develop a true rapport, especially in Washington, where relationships are everything. Often we would have a buffet dinner, either upstairs in the family quarters or, if the weather was nice, in the First Lady's garden. Everyone loved the impromptu invitations, and the evening was always very informal and relaxed. However, this may look a little more formal than your typical movie night at home. Certainly is than mine. Many small official dinners were held in the private family dining room on the second floor, such as this one for Queen Surrogate of Thailand. The 18th century chandelier highlights the 19th century wallpaper, The War of Independence, which Mrs. Kennedy had done when she converted the room from a bedroom into its present state as a dining room. The Fords had the paper removed, and then the Carters put it back up. Then when the Clintons came, they wanted to remove it. But the wallpaper was so fragile that they decided to leave the paper up and upholster green silk fabric over the top of it. And to my knowledge, it has not been changed by President W. and Laura. When Margaret Thatcher received the Medal of Freedom, the Bushes hosted a dinner for the Prime Minister and her husband in the Yellow Oval Room, which is on the second floor in the family quarters. Here, her late husband, Dennis, is giving a very humorous toast to the Bushes. In these less public settings, Mrs. Thatcher made a point of giving the spotlight to her husband. Christmas at the White House was magical, and this is the grand foyer on the state floor. It took months of advanced planning and preparations and 4 days to decorate the house and 40 volunteers to help. But as you can see, the results were spectacular. For 2.5 weeks, the Bushes entertained day and night. Even though it was tiring for all of us, it was fun. Christmas in the White House is very special. Each year there was a theme to the decorations, and my favorite year was when the decorations were all done in needlepoint. Volunteers from all over the United States and from the White House did the ornaments for the 18-foot tree you see here in the blue room. This is Raggedy Ann and Andy, which Mrs. Bush needle-pointed for the tree. We later used some of the ornaments, like this one, as centerpieces for ladies' luncheons because they were so unusual and so beautiful. In the summer, the Bushes often entertained outside. The Congressional Barbecue was held annually on the South Lawn. With spouses, the group was between 800 and 900 people. Because it was outdoors, we were able to have some of the larger bands for entertainment, like the Oak Ridge Boys, Alabama, Glenn Campbell, and the Gatlin Brothers. President Bush loved loud country music. Each year, Mrs. Bush, the First Lady, would invite the Senate ladies for lunch, and this was always one of her favorite events because she had served as honorary chairman of the group when President Bush was vice president. Many of the Senate wives were her close friends. This is in the state dining room. You may not be aware that the Senate ladies began meeting during World War I to roll bandages for the troops, and they continue to meet every Tuesday when the Congress is in session to crochet blankets and make hand puppets for the sick children at Children's Hospital. Another annual event that the Bushes was the Governor's Dinner, and the place setting shown here is the beautiful Johnson china. This was one of my favorites because of the delicate wildflowers. It reminds me of Lady Bird Johnson's efforts toward the beautification of America. There are still 135 place settings of this china, so it can be used for a state dinner, and we used it often. In 1989, President Bush hosted the governors from all 50 states for an educational summit at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. As you can see, that is President Clinton, then governor, on his left with the dark hair leaning forward. In 1990, the president hosted the G7 Economic Summit at Rice University in Houston, Texas. The leaders and their spouses from Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Japan, and the European Union met annually, rotating the host country, discussing the economic problems of the world. For 3 days, the President and First Lady entertained the 7 heads of state at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. President Bush placed great importance on his personal relationships with all the world leaders. He maintained those relationships by telephone conversations and personal diplomacy, including hosting many events. The world leaders that President Bush most frequently entertained were Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, and the late French President Francois Mitterrand, pictured here with me when I greeted him in Munich, Germany, at a small dinner President Bush hosted. And here is the late Turkish President Turgut Özal. The president hosted a breakfast for him in Istanbul. And I'm on the balcony with the 2 presidents overlooking the beautiful Bosphorus River, which divides the east from the west. Many times when the Bushes entertained overseas, we took with us the flowers, china, silver, table linens, and sometimes even the food. As much as possible was done in advance, but of course, there was always more to do once we arrived. Here in Warsaw, Poland, I helped in the kitchen as an assembly line worker getting the cookie plates ready. This particular lunch in honor of General Jaruzelski was memorable to all of us. It was the first time that government leaders met in a social setting with the reformers led by Lech Walesa. And our main course that day, which we had brought over, was beef tenderloin. Many of the guests had not had beef in over 6 months. They were so excited to see it that instead of eating it, they wrapped it up in their napkins and took it home to share with their families. During our state visit to Moscow, the Bushes held a reciprocal dinner at the ambassador's residence, Spaso House. The White House chef with all the food flew over with me. Isaac Stern, the great violinist, flew over to entertain our guests after dinner. It was a beautiful evening. This picture is of the Bushes and Gorbachevs with our then U.S. Ambassador, Jack Matlock, and his wife. It's hard to believe that 1 week later, we would read on the front page of the New York Times about the tanks in Red Square and the attempted coup of Gorbachev. In 1989, Bush and Gorbachev met in the Mediterranean Sea for the Malta Summit. This was just a few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. No agreements were signed, but the two superpowers had a chance to discuss privately the rapid changes taking place in Europe at meetings and at dinners. Some say this marked the end of the Cold War. Excuse me. I flew over to Malta for the summit with the president and senior staff on Air Force One. We had planned a wonderful dinner for Gorbachev on the USS Belknap, a battleship, following their first day of meetings. As I mentioned before, we brought the food and flowers with us for the dinner. I went out to the ship to set things up for the evening, as pictured here. As the day went on, the weather became stormy and the seas very choppy. But we didn't let that bother us. We laughed and sort of giggled about where would we put the Dramamine on the table. Should it go on the right or the left of the goblet? And got that all set up, and after everything was ready, we got the call. Gorbachev refused to leave his ship, the Maxim Gorky, which was a cruise ship that looked like our love boat. All that way and all our preparation, the dinner was canceled and the president went to his ship for dinner. Of course, we were disappointed, but the president felt that the summit, later called the Seasick Summit, had given him the opportunity to begin a very meaningful and personal relationship with Gorbachev that later transformed East-West relationship to one of cooperation. By the way, the crew of the ship loved our dinner. 6 months later, Chairman Gorbachev, then called Chairman, and his wife came to Washington for their state dinner. And at that time, they signed a bilateral arms agreement, so it was all very worthwhile. All the entertaining at the White House was exciting, but the most exciting and most glamorous events were the state dinners. The 30 state dinners that the Bushes hosted were just one component of what is called an official state visit by a head of state government. This is the most coveted invitation. Foreign governments lobby for this invitation during each administration. The visit lasts 3 days and 4 nights and includes meetings as well as an arrival ceremony for the head of state on the South Lawn and a beautiful state dinner. In planning a state dinner, a very important element is the guest list. I compiled the invitation list from several sources. First, there was the official foreign party, which numbered approximately 14. Then suggestions were made from the State Department Protocol Office, as well as from the President's foreign and domestic offices. In addition to those names, the Bushes always wanted to include someone from the Senate, the House, Cabinet, Supreme Court, press, business community, and a member of their family. And it was my responsibility to somehow get everyone included and seated properly. The ceremony pictured here was for Queen Elizabeth. During his state visit in June 1992, President Yeltsin signed a strategic arms reduction agreement with President Bush. And after the signing ceremony, the two presidents held a press conference in the Rose Garden. Sometimes during a state visit, Mrs. Bush wanted to entertain her guests outside the White House. Here, she hosted a luncheon for Mrs. Yeltsin on the front porch of George Washington's home, Mount Vernon in Virginia. Mrs. Yeltsin loved it and is making a toast to Mrs. Bush. While the meetings were going on in the West Wing, preparations for the formal state dinner were beginning in the residence. Chef Hans Raffert and sous chef Pierre Charmand are busy starting the food preparation in the kitchen on the ground floor. In the state dining room, the round dinner tables are being set up and colored tablecloths are being pressed one final time. Prior to the Kennedy administration, a single large U-shaped table with a white damask cloth was used for all official state dinners. The White House florists are busy arranging flowers not only for dinner tables, but also for the state floor and the family quarters. Just before the guests arrive, the waiters meet and make their final check of the tables. It goes without saying that these waiters are the very best. Many of them have served as long as 40 years, through 8 and 9 presidents. Here I am with 2 social aides doing our own last-minute check before the state dinner for President and Mrs. Rowe of Korea. The social aides who assisted my staff on large events were commissioned officers in the United States military, representing all 5 services. They are junior officers with ranks between a second lieutenant and a major. The evening began at 7:30 as the motorcade for the visiting head of state arrives at the north portico of the White House. President and Mrs. Bush go outside to greet them. Here they are welcoming the King of Morocco and his 2 daughters, with the honor guard standing in the background. They're posing for photographers. The honorees are then escorted upstairs to the private quarters for a brief visit. Approximately 20 to 30 minutes later, the President and First Lady escort the visiting head of state and spouse down the grand stairway. The honor guard leads the way, and the Marine Orchestra plays Hail to the Chief. Pictured here are the Gorbachevs. At the bottom of the grand stairway, the principals stop again for pictures before going into the East Room for a receiving line. Note here that the Gorbachevs are in business attire for the state dinner. This was the policy for all Soviet leaders. However, President Yeltsin changed that policy in 1991 when he became president and started to wear black tie. This slide is of Queen Margrethe and her husband, Prince Henrik of Denmark, when they came to the White House for a state dinner. Note how regal the Queen looks in her diamond tiara and beautiful red gown. Quite a contrast to the Gorbachevs. The receiving line was held in the East Room, where guests had an opportunity to greet the Bushes and meet the foreign leader and their spouse. This picture was taken at the Yeltsin State Dinner. I might add that the Bushes always had a receiving line to give them a chance to greet everyone, no matter how small or large the event. Following the receiving line, guests go into the state dining room. When all the guests are in the dining room, the President, First Lady, and honored guests come in and take their places. Pictured here is the dinner for Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and his wife Raisa. The 130 guests are seated at round tables of 10. Once the guests are seated for dinner, toasts are exchanged. Unlike previous presidents, the Bushes preferred to have toasts before dinner rather than after, and so that the members of the press could leave the room. This has now become the tradition. President Teddy Roosevelt purchased the chandelier for the dining room in 1902 in New York City. In 1961, Mrs. Kennedy had it redone in gold-plated bronze doré, and you can see the beautiful results. You'll also notice the ornate eagle lectern which the President and his guests always used. If an interpreter was needed for translation, they had their own podium and microphone in the far left corner of the room. Following the toast, the dinner was French service. It was 4 courses, including dessert. Always the chef and I were very careful and politically sensitive in the planning of the menu, whether it was concerning dietary or religious restrictions. We always served domestic wines, and most often from California. This is the dinner for President Corazon Aquino of the Philippines. At this dinner, the beautiful Reagan china, red, white, and gold, was used. What made this a memorable evening was that President Bush, after being given a message by his aide, stood and announced that the Berlin Wall had fallen. The guests were at first stunned and then broke out into wild applause. And some of you may recognize that's Dina Merrill on Bush's left. When everyone is finished, the President and First Lady lead their guests out of the dining room, down the cross hall where the strolling strings are playing, and into the blue room where coffee is served. Coffee is also served in the red and green rooms. In this slide, the Bushes are escorting Prime Minister Mazowiecki of Poland into the blue room for coffee. After about 20 minutes, the guests go back into the East Room for entertainment. While the guests have been having dinner, the staff has been setting up the East Room in theater style. Planning the entertainment was one of the most enjoyable parts of coordinating a dinner. And that's Yo-Yo Ma pictured there. The entertainers that we were lucky enough, the White House attracts the greatest, such as Jesse Norman, Leontine Price, Isaac Stern, Isaac Perlman, and that's just to name a few. Following the entertainment, there is dancing and champagne in the grand foyer. It's interesting to note that the visiting head of state does not stay for this part of the evening. A little sidebar is that at the state dinner for Boris Yeltsin, he insisted on dancing, and several times during dinner he asked Mrs. Bush if he couldn't dance with her, and she kept refusing, and finally, in frustration, she said to him, in America, it's proper to ask the woman on your right to dance first. And so he took that all in through the interpreter. And Mrs. Lou Gerstner's wife of IBM, president of IBM, was sitting on his right. And so, much to Mrs. Bush's surprise, he turned to Mrs. Gerstner, asked her to dance, so while the strolling strings were playing in the dining room, they waltzed around during dessert. Of course, the guests loved it and applauded. The President and First Lady go upstairs after a few dances, and the evening usually ends about midnight. Despite all our intense planning, sometimes everything did not go off as perfectly as I would have liked. I remember one such evening when the Bushes were entertaining the Prime Minister of Hungary and his wife at their state dinner. We had weather problems. A huge storm swept through Washington that afternoon, delaying planes by several hours, and some never even made it at all. Many of the guests, of course, were late, and that was a problem because it left empty seats at the dinner tables. And as luck would have it, a few of those seats were at the President's table and Mrs. Bush's table. The reason that it was important that those seats be filled was that as I mentioned, the two leaders were going to make their toast. And when they make their toast, the press are standing in the back of the dining room, and the TV cameras are going. And of course, that would be the very thing that they would love to show on the 11 o'clock news, was the fact that there were empty seats at the dinner table. And so we had to move very quickly because we didn't know who was missing exactly until they sat down. And so we were moving people as quick as we could and finally got their tables all set. And it was a very stressful game of musical chairs. The White House Social Secretary plays a crucial supporting role in a state dinner. And as you can see, every detail from the guest list, music, flowers, to the selection of the menu and entertainment, everything is carefully crafted to promote goodwill and positive diplomatic relations and to give each guest a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Here's an informal picture of the Bushes taking a walk around the South Lawn. There are many people who work for the President and First Lady, and every person contributes towards the complete picture. I hope that you will have a sense of how special and unique my position was as White House Social Secretary. My experience working with the Bushes for 12 years was nothing short of incredible. It was an amazing time in my life. My positions both at the Vice President's and then at the White House gave me the opportunity to serve my country in a small way and to do something much bigger than myself. It was wonderful to be here with you tonight. I thank you so much for having me, and I hope that all of you who have not had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. will be able to go through the White House. It is truly the people's house and a house that we can all be very proud of. Thank you. So I would be happy to answer any questions if you have any. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? I would say about 9 o'clock, but in the morning, except on state dinner events, we would get there a little bit earlier because the arrival ceremony would start around 9 or 9:30. But in Washington, they seem to work, I know now living in California, they work much later. And so our day wouldn't end until maybe 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. And of course, if there was an evening event at the White House, then I would stay until it was over. So it's a long day, but it's exciting, and it isn't every day, and you just, you do it. Any other questions?
During the summit in Houston, they have a dinner at the August date.
At the where?
You see the August date.
We did. We did. It was a very small dinner, and I think that, as I recall, that was the first dinner, the opening dinner was there, and then we had another larger dinner at the Houston Museum of Art, and I can't remember if they had a third dinner, and then we had lunches right on the campus at Rice University. And Mrs. Bush had a separate schedule from the president, took the wives out on a couple trips, I think day trips, which were fun for them. So, any other questions?
During all the wonderful events you were able to plan and to also attend, and all the people you got to meet, what was your most interesting guest? And also, what was your favorite event?
Well, the fun thing about the events at the White House is each one has its own personality. And so for reasons, when Gorbachev came, it was very exciting because that was the first state dinner from a leader of Russia. So that was, of course, very exciting. But then, of course, when Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came, everybody went crazy. And that was very exciting, too. I mean, I guess that probably was my favorite, just because it was very glamorous. And everybody who came to the state dinner, that I think today it's funny, when I initially went to the White House, it was always a long dress, and even if you wore a sleeveless dress, you wore long white gloves, and it was very, very formal. In today's world, people came in pants and short dresses, and the men always were in tuxedos, but the women came in some rather unusual outfits. certainly for the Queen, they were dressed to the nines. I mean, everybody looked beautiful, and the jewelry and the whole thing. It was a very special dinner, and she was so lovely and so gracious, and met with staff later who had helped make their visit pleasant. She had us all over to Blair House, so it was a very memorable event for me.
You mentioned in your book that the Bushes often would decide last minute to host an event. What's the shortest amount of time you've ever had to plan?
Well, the president would get into the office in the morning, and you know, probably by 9 o'clock. I mean, usually it was that morning. I would say 9 to 11. He'd say, "Gosh, we're not doing anything tonight," and I'd say, "I know, isn't that terrific? You have the night off." And he said, "No, absolutely not. We've got to use every moment while we're here." And he said, "Now, these are a few people I'd like to have over. Would you call and get a movie and start with this group, and then just fit anybody else in that we need to invite over and get going?" And fortunately, everybody loved it when they could come. I mean, they would break all sorts of appointments just to come. And some of our movies were marginal, but we had a little more trouble getting the movies than we did the people. Yes? Now, why would I tell you that? Well, I think, you know, we had some of these little problems, as I mentioned, you know, that weren't always our fault, but the press would take us to task on them. And I do remember, it wasn't really my fault at all, but one of our very first state dinners, and so we were all pretty nervous about it, and opened up the Washington Post, who is not very kind, as you know, and always to us in the press. And the whole story, most of the story, was about there being a cobweb in the chandelier going up the stairs from the ground floor. And I mean, that was like 3 or 4 paragraphs. And it was like, what about the dinner? What did you think about the dinner? So, but we were lucky. I tried to stay out of the line of fire on that. Yes?
I'm fascinated to learn a little bit more about the transportation of flowers and food and all of those things to foreign countries for a state dinner.
Well, I think one of the main reasons that they do that is sometimes there are food problems. When we were traveling, you have to remember this was a while back, and it was felt that the president was really safer with the food. We didn't always take all of it, but we might take some of it. And then on special occasions like actually, we took the flowers when we did the dinner at Spaso House in Moscow, but I ended up arranging the flowers. So it wasn't like totally set flower arrangements. In the case that you saw the picture on the Belknap, yes, but that was like 1 or 2 arrangements, so it wasn't hard to put them on the plane. And it was... The china was taken when we went to Spaso House because they simply didn't have it. And they had really, I mean, this was the first time that any president had gone to Moscow, let alone entertained at Spaso House. So they were not as well equipped as some of the other embassies. Obviously, in Great Britain, they had everything they needed, and Poland was the same way, and we took things there. So it was, they felt important, so we did it.
I just have a question. Out of all your entertaining, both just smaller gatherings and the larger state dinners, what would be just a good rule of thumb that you could give, just a couple of good tips just to anyone that's wanting to entertain both smaller gatherings and large gatherings? What are some things that just held true for you?
Well, I would say one of the things that I tried to do, and Mrs. Bush always did, was the minute your guests arrive, to set them at ease and make them feel immediately comfortable, depending upon what that occasion is and where it's being held. But if it's in your own home, certainly you're going to be greeting them warmly, taking their coat, come in, sit down, what can I get you, and that kind of thing, because I think people, they want to be set at ease. And I know many, many times when we were at the Vice President's house, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to stand at the front door and people would come in. And I was also at the front door when people would leave. And they would often say, I just can't believe how wonderful the Bushes are, how warm, how friendly they are. I never had any idea. And I think they put everybody at ease that way. And Mrs. Bush always would talk about what her family was doing, what the children were doing, about the dog. I mean, things that every woman and every man want to hear. And it wasn't the aloof things like, well, we're doing this. It was never that. It was always, we are one of you. And they are. And that's why it came through. And it was so genuine. But I think that you set the stage before your guests arrive, whether it be, your food and your flowers and whatever you want to do for the party, and get that set so that when they arrive, you can really be a hostess and make them feel comfortable and enjoy the moment and make it a memorable time. Sort of rambling.
Quick question. What kind of accommodations did the White House make for Islamic and Jewish guests as far as adhering to the kosher and halal food laws?
Yes, when we had a couple dinners with the Prime Minister from Israel, and we had kosher dinners. We did a totally separate dinner for them. And as it turns out, the White House does not have the proper kitchen. And so they were done by a group in Baltimore, because it has to be on special plates and the food all has to be special. And they were brought in, and then we would plan our dinner to be something that looked the same. I mean, we wouldn't have so it wouldn't be obvious to everybody that you were having a separate dinner, although they had to have glass plates. And we also had separate wine for them. I don't remember ever having an occasion with the Muslim group that we had. We didn't have to do anything special. But we always, when people, foreigners like that, I didn't mention that, but when they would call and respond to a dinner, particularly if it was something of that sort, like a group, the people from Israel, then we would say, would you like a kosher meal? And they would say yes or no. I mean, we would immediately, or are you vegetarian? And so we did try to accommodate everybody. I'm sorry, what did you? Well, I think I maybe mentioned it before, but there is for a state dinner, there's the official party that is in town. That's usually about 14 or 15 people, and then the United States counterparts of those foreign group. Then we had the protocol office from the State Department would suggest names. The president's domestic office would suggest names. And then the Bushes, on decided separately from that that they wanted representatives from the House, the Senate, the Cabinet, and a variety number of people, plus friends and maybe even somebody from their family. So with 130 guests, and you are allowed to bring your spouse or your engaged. If you were engaged, you were allowed to bring them. If you were just single, we did not ask you to bring a date. But it was hard to fit everybody in. Fortunately, the Bushes had 30 state dinners, so we got a lot of people in over that period of time. Because if you want to reach out and get business leaders and grassroots and family. So it was a nice mix of people. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank Laurie Firestone for taking the time to be with us here tonight. Those were very interesting and entertaining comments that she had to offer. And indeed, thank you, Laurie, for taking us inside the White House. I'd also like to once again thank our sponsors, ConocoPhillips and their representatives, Sylvia Hansen and her husband David, Erica Rodriguez and her husband Simon Choi. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us. And now I'd like to invite you to join us for the reception in the lobby and for the book signing of Laurie's book, An Affair to Remember, after which you can all go over across the plaza to the library and view the White House in miniature exhibit. Once again, thank you for joining us this evening.